If you clicked on this video, you probably want to understand how getting Swiss residency actually works, not just the simplified version that you hear everywhere else. Now, I know this process because I've been through it myself. I moved to Switzerland and dealt with the job offers, the housing search, the registrations, and the real bottlenecks that most videos completely ignore or at least misrepresent. Switzerland does not have one immigration system. It has two fundamentally different paths, and mixing them up creates false expectations for both EU and non-EU citizens. In this video, I will show you which path applies to you, where people really get stuck, and why the biggest obstacle is often not the permit. If you're serious about moving to Switzerland, make sure you watch this video until the end, because missing out on the details can easily cost you months of time wasted.
So Raphael, what pathways are there to get a visa for Switzerland?
The most important distinction here is basically there are two different systems based on whether you're an EU/EFTA citizen or not. And you should really not mix these, because I found so many videos and people writing things on blogs where basically these two different rule systems are mixed, and that just causes confusion and will literally tell you the wrong things. The good news is that if you're an EU or EFTA citizen, so basically the EU and also Liechtenstein, Iceland, Norway, then you will have it easier because the freedom of movement agreement applies. So legally the process is relatively straightforward. You ideally accept a job offer, and then you make your move to Switzerland, you register at the municipality, so the Gemeinde in German, within 14 days, ideally maybe the first few days to be on the safe side. And that's it pretty much. Like this, you can basically get the residence permit within one day. You literally go there, you just say, hey, I'm here. And then a while later, you actually get the plastic card. But just registering is sort of already fulfilling the requirement. The good thing is you don't need to apply upfront before coming there. You don't need a specific sponsorship from your employer. They don't need to do anything at all, except the usual stuff like issuing the work contract, which they would need to do anyways. While the card that you will eventually get, of course, it may take a couple of weeks, but you don't need to wait for that. This is because as an EU/EFTA citizen, you're privileged. There's one thing that most people overlook, and that actually makes it not quite as easy. And that is actually getting housing, because the thing is, you cannot register in Switzerland if you don't have some form of housing. So you require some kind of a rental contract. Very often it's a bit hard to actually get a landlord to rent you their apartment if you don't have a work contract. And even if you do, then it can be a bit difficult depending on where you look. Depending on, if you speak the local language, if you maybe have friends where you can stay, or if you're maybe a bit familiar with Switzerland already, or if you're coming from, a slightly different culture, maybe speak a completely different language, and Switzerland is a very new country to you, then it will be more difficult to even secure that apartment rental contract, which you need to get the work permit and residence permit process even started, even as an EU citizen. And especially if you have budget restrictions because maybe you have kids or a partner that you need to pay for in the beginning because they don't have a job yet, and maybe your initial salary isn't as good as you hoped for, then you might be looking at many apartments and they might reject you. What I see many people doing is living in Airbnbs or forms of temporary housing, which typically works, but which is of course more expensive. And if you don't want to do that, if you can't afford that, or for whatever reason you don't want to do that, then typically means your registration and possibly your work start will be delayed, depending on how flexible your employer is. So in the end, everything gets delayed. You might start, like a month or two later than necessary. You will lose out on 1 or 2 months of salary. So this can be quite costly in the end. And at any rate, it can be very, very annoying. If you have a job offer and a work contract signed, then the housing can still make moving to Switzerland quite challenging.
What if I am not an EU or EFTA citizen? Is there a chance for me to move to Switzerland?
If you're a non-EU citizen, the whole thing becomes much more complicated, because you can't just show up in Switzerland and say, hey, I'm here. Your employer actually needs to sponsor you. So don't worry if you have a work contract. They are probably working on it, because they will not give you one if they already know that they must sponsor you a visa. Because you cannot apply for it yourself, there are relatively strict limits, so only about 4,500 longer-term B permits can be issued every year to non-EU EFTA citizens. There's quotas for each canton, and the cantons need to approve, and the federal government needs to approve. You must be really good, because otherwise nobody will sponsor your visa. If they can find somebody from the EU or EFTA, or somebody who is not EU EFTA citizen but already lives in Switzerland, they basically count in the same bucket, then they will always take somebody of that easier category. A, because they have to, like that's literally the law. Also, of course, because it's easier for them. Which especially now, in 2026, where the job market has shifted from a talent market where as a talent you had a lot of choice to more of an employer market where employers have a lot of choice because so many talents are coming in. And this may sound brutal at first, but in reality, people do get in. Like people not from the EU do get hired. As you can imagine, not all of them are like Nobel Prize winners or exceptional athletes or whatever. More or less normal people who are just very qualified in certain skill sets that are rare and do not sufficiently exist in Switzerland already or in the EU. They do get actually hired under this 4,500 long-term quota. And then there's also another quota actually for shorter term permits. This is typically not so interesting because you really want the long-term permit. The system is selective, but it's not random. The criteria are relatively clear. It is merit-based. Luck plays a role, of course, but in the end, it is merit-based. You just need to be very, very special. And then there is a good chance that you're actually getting in. And of course, the cool thing is once you're in, as long as you don't leave, as long as you keep your job, eventually you could actually become Swiss with all its benefits. So there is a very, very high reward waiting for you. Now, if you are unsure whether your profile and your passport actually give you a realistic chance to get into Switzerland, this is where a quick conversation can really save you a lot of time. Book a short call with me and you can get a clear answer on whether Switzerland makes sense for you right now. The link is, as always, down in the description. So now you might be asking which companies can actually get me in if I'm a non-EU EFTA citizen, but also maybe if I actually am an EU citizen, just not a German speaker, so it might be a bit more difficult to, adapt to the local culture. Then this same thinking can also play a bit of a role, even though it's not as strict from a legal standpoint. If you're a non-EU EFTA citizen, chances will be much better with large multinational tech companies. Very often they have the best immigration lawyers. They do this all the time, whereas smaller companies resent the paperwork of demonstrating that you have such special abilities that it's worth bringing you in. They might just say, okay, we can find somebody from the EU/EFTA or within Switzerland. Why even bother with all this? Small and medium-sized companies, it's not impossible. Like I want to make that clear, but it's unlikely that they will sponsor your visa, so you should probably not target them too much. Unless you know somebody very well, then yeah, maybe you can try.
All right, I have understood how to qualify for a work permit in Switzerland. Is there just one type, or are there multiple options?
Let's look at the main two types of permits. The one type of permit that you would typically want to go for is the so-called B permit. You can also renew it for another 5 years. Or if you belong to a certain list of nationalities, then you can often even get the longer term C permit after 5 years right away. If you don't belong to this list of nationalities, then you will need to wait another 5 years, so a total of 10 years until you get the C permit, which is sort of the very long-term permit for settling down and which will give you a few additional rights, which will basically make you almost a Swiss person without granting you Swiss citizenship. The L permit, it is a bit limited because first of all, it's typically limited to a couple of months and then it can maybe be extended. But some banks will not open a bank account for you. For example, if you have the L permit versus the B permit, you would typically get the L permit and only want the L permit if from the very beginning you do not intend to stay in Switzerland for a long time. So for example, if you just come for a 6-month project to Switzerland, you will get the L permit and it will be fine because you probably are going to leave at the end anyways. It has some downsides. For example, many banks will refuse you, will not open a bank account, especially fintech banks. They will just not have you. unless you have a B or C permit. You also get the L permit, for example, if you actually don't have a job offer. So this is also something you could do. And if you have enough savings, you could actually come to Switzerland, get an apartment, like an Airbnb or something, and say, I want to be on site for job interviews and everything. I want to be there already. And then it's only given to you for a couple of months typically, and then maybe you can renew it. This is an option for job seekers. Whether it's a good idea, it's up to you. As a tourist, you can typically come to Switzerland. It's relatively easy. Again, depends a bit, of course, on your nationality. But even if you are not an EU EFTA citizen, there's a lot of passports that will allow you to travel to Switzerland as a tourist for example, on-site interviews if that's necessary. But of course, you need to check the exact criteria that apply to you. So now let's look at the real possible timelines with everything included. Again, here, the main distinction is, are you an EU EFTA citizen or not? Because as I said earlier, as an EU EFTA citizen, it's much easier. The main thing is you need to accept a job, have a working contract, and then you need to start the process of moving to Switzerland, which means that you are looking for apartments. And this is actually the crucial step, because looking for an apartment, it can, if you're lucky, it can take like 1 or 2 weeks, but it could also take maybe 2 months, especially if you don't have help, if you don't speak the local language, which is typically German or French, or if you're just unlucky, if you come in the wrong time of the year, it can take very long. If you look in Zurich or Geneva or Basel, it will probably take longer than if you're looking in a smaller suburb of these cities, or also just in a smaller village. For example, if you have the privilege of mostly working from home and only coming to the office every now and then, this would dramatically ease your apartment search, because it would enable you to live a bit further out on the countryside and use the great public transportation in Switzerland. If you need to be in the office every day, then actually being closer to the city, or at least in the city, is more important, making the apartment search more difficult. And then the cool thing is, if you're an EU EFTA citizen, you can just basically, like in the EU, you can just register within 40 days of arrival. So you can just even move in the apartment, and you have up to 14 days until you go to the municipality and register. Ideally, you do it on like the first or second day, so you don't forget, but you could do it up to 14 days after moving in. And then a couple of weeks later, you will get this permit card, which looks a bit like a driver's license card, or like other residence permits in the EU nowadays. You don't need this card typically from day one. Like some banks will require it, but in most cases you can basically show them the registration confirmation from the municipality. So you don't need to wait 4 weeks until you get the actual plastic card, until you can do things. There's only like a very small number of things where maybe you actually have to wait a month, but it will be okay. Everything will be done in a couple of weeks, including the plastic card, and the registration with the municipality, it's done in like 1 day. Whereas, if you factor in looking for an apartment, it could actually take a couple more weeks, up to 3 months, if it takes you long to find an apartment. Now, for non-EU EFTA citizens, as I said, it's more difficult, because the employer needs to apply for you, needs to sponsor your visa, initiate the process, and then the canton needs to review it. And sometimes they might require some additional documents. It really depends on your company. Like if your company is doing this all the time, then probably it will go through faster. So if you work for the big tech companies, everything should pass relatively fast, and ideally there will not be any follow-up questions. But it can happen, and it depends a bit on the time of the year. If you come like in Q1, typically it's faster. Whereas if you come in Q4, it could be a bit more difficult. Worst case, the quota for the year could actually be used up, and then you might have to wait until the next year. So typically after around 8 to 12 weeks, you get that permit. And then you can try and start the apartment search process in parallel, but basically you're sort of at the end of the queue, because nobody really will prioritize your apartment application if it's not even clear if you get the work permit, or at least to them it's not clear. They probably have like 10 other people at least who already have a permit, or who are EU citizens and don't need to worry about it. So this will typically make it a bit longer. It will basically delay your process for 2-3 months. So it's more of a process that takes a couple of months, whereas the EU EFTA pathway takes more like a couple of weeks. And then there's one exception, which probably doesn't really matter to you, but I just want to mention it anyways. Like if you became very rich through cryptocurrencies, or your first or your last startup or whatever, it's actually possible to get a visa for Switzerland based on simply your wealth, most importantly, the income that you are living from. It must also come from outside of Switzerland. So this is a case, if you have like dividends from other companies or you have businesses around the world and you have wealth typically around 10 million Swiss francs or more. Now, if you're thinking about what all of this means for your own specific situation, that is exactly the right reaction. Because understanding the Swiss immigration process is only step one. The real question is whether Switzerland is actually the best move for you right now, given your passport, your career stage, and how much structure versus flexibility you want in your life. In the next video, I'm going to take this one step further and compare Switzerland with Austria. I'm going to break down the real trade-offs between the two countries. I will look at the income, taxes, career leverage, the quality of life, and of course, the long-term stability. If you want to choose the country that actually fits your situation instead of just following the hype, watch the next video now.